Have you ever had so much to do that your brain freezes and you end up doing absolutely nothing? Guys, I've been hit hard by the art block. Between trying to build up an inventory for conventions, a new job, wedding planning, and just generally getting my life together, it has been so hard to get myself to work on stuff, especially when all of those things have little subcategory things too. So in an effort to break myself out of this paralysis, I've enlisted the help of my beautiful subscribers, and you guys really came through. So for this video, I have selected 3 of the dozens of incredible OCs submitted to my Google form. It's in the description. And with that, my name is Teddy. Welcome to the channel. Now let's make some art, huh? Up first, we have Calliope, submitted by Mobert. She was an absolutely perfect place to start. First of all, look at that gorgeous pastel blue skin. How can I resist? But then I saw that she exists in a 1970s inspired setting, with her personal style being 1930s inspired. If you watched my previous video about my own OCs, you'll know that is right up my alley. It's like retro on retro. Ugh, delicious. She's described as being 20-something and works in the business of information, alongside her brother and foster sister. It sounds like she has an arc that involves a serious downward spiral, and I'm sure her being the leader of this intelligence network would naturally lead to some shady dealings. Mobert's submission mentions her making repeated bad decisions over the course of her story, justifying them by saying she's doing what she does for her family. Whether that's actually the case or she's just using Walter White-style excuses, well, that is certainly not for me to say. However, if one is to fall from grace, they must start from a high point to begin with, right? So I wanted to give her a look that feels very put together and curated, based on the eras mentioned, to show her confidence and how she feels secure. Then as time goes on, she can become more disheveled and stuff. Another thing that was brought up was how she was intended to resemble the sky. The character art that I'm going off of was just a bust. As said in the submission, Mobert suffers from the disease that prevents them from drawing anything below the clavicle. Very tragic, yes. But it was clear that her skin and hair were meant to resemble a cloudy sky. I intended to keep that general idea, blue skin and white hair, but as I was designing her, she ended up with more of a dusky kind of vibe, which I was really into because I think it fits her well thematically from what we know. Evening is the transition from day to night, and her arc involves her descending to a dark place. With those shady dealings, I mean, she isn't a bright sunny day kind of sky, but she isn't full midnight darkness either. So, like, she does operate in shadow, but the shadows negatively affect her too? Does that make sense? I mean, in order to cast a shadow, there has to be some light, right? I knew I wanted to go for a sort of combination of fashion from the 2 eras. I was trying to think of ways that she could evoke the feeling of the 30s using clothing that would be available during the 70s. For example, her pants. Women didn't wear capri pants in the 30s, but they did wear cropped culottes, a much flowier kind of trouser that fell around the mid-calf. The style of boot that I gave her is similar to a vintage women's hiking boot, something that shows her as being very active and on the move, but with a more fashionable heel and overall design that makes it clearly not for a trek through the mountains. I like that the tall laces could represent her mental state. Perhaps as her arc progresses, she doesn't bother to lace them up all the way anymore. And I feel like the white accent her boots give her design more so resembles the look of a full moon against a darkening sky, as opposed to the clouds that I originally intended them to convey when conceptualizing. Actually, when I was deciding to give her a fur-trimmed coat, I thought the fur would be clouds too. But as the Twilight motif started to solidify, I thought she needed more dark in her outfit, so I made the fur sparkle like the night sky. Though this kind of coat isn't exactly the Penny Lane style, I feel like it's close enough that it still feels 70s. Listen, you give me specific time periods to work with, and I am leaning in. I didn't want her to look like a sunset, so her colors ended up very cool-toned overall. Mostly blues and purples with a hint of gold. I really like the way her top came out. The exaggerated collar is an overlap in style from both eras, but adding in the chain cabochon brooches emphasizes that vintage feeling. Her pearl necklace also feels older and has the added benefit of looking like a bunch of little moons. Her hair ended up with a similar sort of thing going on, looking like the moon. I mean, and of course I had to keep that fluffy bob she had originally, with it being like styled to high heaven like the old days. Since her design is very symmetrical, I like that her hair gives a little more variation with that extreme side part. The bow on her belt helps too, and both of those things could serve as another sort of visual representation of her declining mental state as time goes on. I hope I did justice to what you imagined for her, Mobert. I took quite a lot of creative liberties and sort of just added in things that I personally like, but I think it ended up working out. It's funny how she resembles so closely the original drawing, like, in my mind, but also she looks completely different. I would love to see this design in your style, though. I think it would look really nice. I even made sure to give her some visual interest around her neck to serve as a kind of cutoff point and accommodate for your condition. Our next guest is Marisol. Her submission had the option to stay anonymous checked, but if her creator is so willing, I would love to know more about her lore. She's described as being the result of what happens when there's an attempt to resurrect someone who has been killed. It seems as though this is the case even if the resurrection is unsuccessful, or perhaps only if it's unsuccessful, as the goal of these duplicates is to solve the mystery of how their original counterpart met their end, and why there was an attempt at resurrection. This premise is really cool, and I have questions. Who or what makes these mimics? What happens if they accomplish that goal? Do they, cease to exist? Do they wither away into dust? Thanos snap style? Do they come into being already knowing that they're a copy in the first place, like how gems emerge knowing their purpose? Or do they start out believing themselves to be the original, like how the Mauler twins do? Do they have any of the original's memories? I have to assume they don't, or that maybe they only remember a certain period leading up to the original's death. Otherwise, that mystery wouldn't be very mysterious. I'm also curious if Marisol is the protagonist of this story. I think that implies she is her own person beyond just existing to fulfill a purpose, right? Her personality is described as cheerful and a bit mischievous, but is that really what she's like? Or is that influenced by the person she's a copy of? Was that person's name even Marisol in the first place? I wonder how she feels about knowing she's a duplicate too. How all of her kind feels about it, really. Do they care for their originals? Do they care about solving that mystery? Or do they just simply feel compelled to do so based on the nature of their creation? Oh, this whole thing is so juicy. I want to know more. As for the design submitted, I think that's pretty cool too. The crystals on her skin really caught my eye. They seem to be an attribute that marks one as being a mimic, which means they're either there from the moment they're created or they begin to grow over time. I think if either of these were the case, it would have to correlate with whether or not they know from the jump that they're a copy. Like, the crystals are a dead giveaway, so if they know right away, then they have to have had them from the start. But if it's something they have to find out, maybe the crystals don't show up until later on. That amount of time could also vary depending on certain factors, leading to some interesting character moments and tension, potentially. When I was adding them, I went with something more like the second interpretation, and now that I'm revisiting her again a bit later, I think I may have been incorrect. I got so excited to draw them a certain way that I didn't really think about them too hard. Taking a closer look at the character illustrations in the submission and combining that with the description of the crystalline skin as being like mirrors or glass, it's possible her creator's intention was that this feature was more flush against a duplicate's skin. If that's the case, I feel like it would be hard for the effect to spread, and so it must be there from the start. However, something I do like about them more so growing on top of the skin is that it raises the possibility of someone trying to remove them. Perhaps there's a mimic who's trying to be low profile for their mission, or maybe there's someone who absolutely hates being identified as a copy of a person and resents the crystals for that reason. Maybe there's someone in complete denial that scrapes it off to delude themselves into believing they're the original. Would it grow back in that case? I could go on. All of this reminded me a bit of Lake from Infinity Train. That show is amazing. Just know it got canceled and many things sadly go unanswered to this day. It eats away at me. Anyways, Lake themselves is essentially a copy of a person too. They come from the dimension where reflections live, but so deeply wanted to live as their own person, and that is not allowed. When they get pulled from that mirror world into the real world, it was while they were being seen in a surface made of chrome. Thus, their entire body is made of chrome. And thinking about Lake is what made me decide to give Marisol a haircut, to signify her personhood. She did go a little too short on the bangs, but give her a break. It was her first time trying to cut them, okay? We've all been there. I see you. So Lake is an incredible character for a lot of reasons, but one that I absolutely have to mention is that they're heavily implied to be trans. I personally see them as non-binary, and I think that's the more common interpretation. I feel like the show supports it pretty heavily. They change their clothing, drastically change their hair, and do some DIY piercings, and even end up choosing a noun-based name. The culture. Anon's submission doesn't say anything about Marisol's gender, but there was just something about this design that resonated with me in a similar way that Lake's does. So I tried to douse her in that classic non-binary swag. I tried to keep her pretty androgynous too, which I also think just generally works with elves for some reason. I feel like that's pretty common. And I think she's an elf, based on her ears. And I gave her a casual adventurer kind of style. Again, I would love to know more about the world she lives in, but I went with a sort of semi-modern fantasy vibe. I imagine she thinks more about the practicality of what she's wearing, but ends up looking cool anyways because she just is cool and she rocks it. So yeah, even if I got it wrong, I hope you like how she ended up. Same with the crystals, which I almost definitely got wrong. But hey, all three of the characters we're drawing today were submitted into the Go Nuts category, so we could just say it's part of being a redesign, right? I'm pretty sure the order I drew these characters was just based on the order in which they were submitted to the Google form, but it really seems to have worked out for the best, I think. Calliope was so utterly in my wheelhouse that doing her design was just like a fun little relaxing dip into some stuff I'm pretty familiar with and enjoy. Then with Marisol, I got to challenge myself a little bit, mostly with the crystals. It felt like a nice little study amidst all the fun. By now I was ready to do something a little more extravagant, which is good because this character deserves it. Our final guest for the day is the Sun, a cosmic entity from the webtoon Proxima Luminis and a deity of a place called Zenith, not the Winx one. The creator, who also happens to be named Sun, mentions that the character is actually out of commission by the time of the story, as the warmth of her soul became something called Forever Fire, which allows life to exist on the planet that basks in her warmth. So this design will actually be her ancient form from before the fall, which in modern day is only really known from the depictions in murals and statues. Sun mentioned my Daphne nymph design in the submission too, which if you guys are new here is part of my series Redesigning and Rewriting Winx Club. For that one, I was going for something really ethereal, as in my rewrite, Nymphix is not so much a fairy form as it is becoming a spirit with a body made of pure magic. I wanted that Daphne design to feel like her body was glowing from within. But honestly, I'm not sure I entirely captured what I was seeing in my head, so this is actually kind of like a nice little redo for me. There's another comic that keeps popping into my mind whenever I think about this, which I never actually read, but I would see on Tumblr all the time and just marvel at the artwork. Have any of you ever heard of Ava's Demon? It came out in 2012, so I was definitely up to my neck in Homestuck at the time, which I also want to do designs for, but it looks like Ava's Demon is still ongoing to this day. Wow. Anyways, my main point is that I have always admired, maybe envied, how Michelle Fuss draws her characters in a way that makes them look so glowy. I won't tell you spoilers, and I don't even really know that many, but I checked the wiki, and the demon in the story is herself fire-themed, which is pretty much the same theming I had for Daphne, and now I'm working with again for the Sun. More specifically, Phoenix and Flaming Ball of Gas theming, respectively. I think a big part of achieving that effect is coloring all of the line art, not just the inner parts, which I didn't do for Daphne until after the video went out. So you can see the difference from the video's final look in her print and sticker look. I was a little worried about making this design too similar to Daph, but I think it ended up standing on its own. They do both have a lot of orange and long hair and flowy outfits and covered eyes, but I still feel like there's a difference between them. The sun does have a lot more red, which is very different from her original look too, actually, where she was mostly white and some gold. I think it's meant to make her look like a marble statue, but marble statues are famously pretty cold, and I really wanted to capture that feeling of heat radiating from her. Sun said there's a few things that are pretty integral to signifying a design as being this character. That being her spiky crown obscuring her eyes, long flowing hair, gold jewelry, and feminine presentation. I kept to that for the most part, but I did take a little creative liberty when it came to the first item on that list. Because she is the personification of a star, I wanted there to be part of her that emits a bright light. So I thought it would be cool if, rather than the crown itself covering her eyes, it's more like her face is so blindingly radiant that it actually makes it impossible to perceive her eyes. Kind of like how you aren't supposed to look directly into the sun, and also like how cops shine their flashlights at you so you can't see their faces. Since this is an interpretation of how she looked when she was still alive, I imagine that over time, depictions began to show her crown sitting lower because no one could accurately portray this blinding light in the form of like carvings and stuff. In retrospect, I could have gone a lot crazier with her jewelry, but I think that's something I'm finding applies to a lot of my stuff in general. I think I've talked about this before, but I feel like my art is really detailed in some aspects, which maybe leads to it not being detailed enough in other areas. It's something I'm trying to work on. Something I do really like, though, is the way that some of the gold is incorporated into her clothing as a trim, or where it's holding the fabric draped over her lower half. Overall, I think she came out looking like a goddess, which was the most important thing. Everybody go check out Proxima Luminis on Webtoon. It's made by one of us! I'm sure all you artists watching are familiar with how much art block sucks. I can end up with so much on my plate that I just feel paralyzed. Chipping away at this video bit by bit and seeing it come to fruition felt like fighting against a riptide. But now I have finally reached the shore. Thank God. Thank you so much to everyone who shared their brain children with me. I'll definitely be revisiting that list of submitted characters, especially all the super cool Winx ones. I want to do a video just of them. I know that's what most of you are here for. Hey, I ain't complaining. That's what I'm here for too, allegedly. But yeah, thanks. All of you are so thoughtful and supportive, and I feel so lucky that you found my silly little YouTube channel. If you haven't followed me on Tumblr, I'm more active there, even when I take an accidental hiatus on here, so if you want to come on down, come on down! I hope you had fun with our guests today, and with that, I'll see you next time. Bye! Oh, that's right, I also have a shop. Go check out the shop.